Cellular respiration occurs in all organisms, including plants. Sometimes people think plants go through photosynthesis, animals go through cellular respiration, but all organisms go through cellular respiration. We're going to focus on how cellular respiration happens in eukaryotic organisms, those with membrane-bound organelles. But essentially what's going on is in plants, right, in photosynthetic organisms, plants, algae, the sugars that are produced in photosynthesis, right, are going to be broken down in cellular respiration. In animals, fungi, okay, things like that are heterotrophs, okay, such as ourselves, we have our food that we eat. Through the process of digestion, our food is broken down, and we end up with simple sugars, glucose. Now, there are two things that can happen. What we usually think of is that glucose, in the presence of oxygen as well, right, all goes into the mitochondrion, and then we get a lot of ATP and some other products. There is an alternative to this, which is what happens when there's no oxygen available, and that glucose is still broken down a little bit, and we get a little bit of ATP. Okay, so we can get a little bit of ATP without oxygen, or we can get a lot of ATP if oxygen is available. So we're going to look at how each of those occurs. When oxygen is present, we call that aerobic respiration, right? Think aero, kind of sounds like air. Okay. So when oxygen is present, we are going to be able to go through aerobic respiration, and this is the one that you normally think of when you think of cellular respiration. So what's happening is we are taking our glucose molecule and using oxygen to help break down that glucose. We get carbon dioxide and water as waste products, and we get 36 ATP, sometimes even 38, depending on how efficient it is. This is our energy source. Okay. So using that energy that's stored in the sugar, stored in our food, to get that energy that's usable by cells to go through things like active transport, for example, or providing energy for all of the cellular reactions that have to happen. We won't discuss all of the steps of cellular respiration and aerobic respiration, but there is one that I would like you to be familiar with, and that is glycolysis. And that's because glycolysis is the very first thing that happens, and in a very simple version is what we're doing is we're taking our glucose, which remember C6H12O6, okay, so 6 carbon atoms in that glucose molecule, and it's being split in half, okay? So you end up with 2 pyruvic acid or pyruvate molecules that each contain 3 carbon atoms. So remember, when you break bonds, okay, break a bond, that is what we call an exothermic reaction or a decomposition reaction. Exothermic energy is being released, and so right away when you break that glucose molecule into 2 pyruvic acid molecules, you get 2 ATP. So right away we're getting energy, and this happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay? So glycolysis, which happens right away, occurs in the cytoplasm, and then what happens after that depends on if oxygen's present or not. When oxygen is present, right, aerobic respiration, what happens is after glycolysis occurs, so here's glycolysis, step 1, we get 2 ATP molecules from that, the pyruvic acid then enters the mitochondrion of the cell. And it goes through this whole series of steps, including the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And it just basically is breaking down those carbon molecules more and more and more. And as those carbon molecules are getting broken down, we get our carbon dioxide, right? So there's one of our products. Okay. We get label a reactant of glucose going into glycolysis. We get carbon dioxide that are being released. We get more ATP molecules from the Krebs cycle. And then we get even more ATP molecules from the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is where the oxygen is used. So there's our other reactant in cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, right? The oxygen is used in the electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain is also where the product of water is released. But remember, The goal of aerobic respiration is to produce these ATP molecules, right? So when oxygen is available, we get a lot of ATP because the mitochondria can go through the electron transport chain to really fully break down that glucose molecule. So you get lots and lots of energy. When oxygen is not available, that's known as anaerobic, right? Without oxygen. Anaerobic respiration starts off very similarly with glycolysis, but then it doesn't go through the rest of it. So anaerobic respiration only happens in the cytoplasm, whereas aerobic respiration starts in the cytoplasm, but then mostly occurs in the mitochondria. So what happens in anaerobic respiration is that glucose is broken down a little bit, and then your products depend on the type of cell. So in the muscle cells of animals, such as ourselves, the products are lactic acid and then 2 ATP molecules. In plants and yeast cells, we get those 2 ATP, but also we get ethanol and carbon dioxide. So this process that occurs in plants and yeast, if it's anaerobic, is also called fermentation. It can be called fermentation in animals as well, but you may have heard fermentation in terms of alcohol brewing, okay? So if you're brewing beer or making wine, they let things ferment, okay? And that means oxygen is not there, but there's your alcohol, okay? The ethanol is the alcohol and then carbon dioxide. So let's look at why this happens. So anaerobic respiration still starts off with glycolysis, which we can see right here, glucose being broken down into 2-pyruvate or 2-pyruvic acid, and this is where we get our 2 ATP molecules. Okay? But the reason that it can't just stop there is that the cell needs to be able to create more NADH, so we need to basically recycle this NADH into NAD+, and you don't have to worry about what any of that means right now. Just know that if anaerobic respiration didn't occur, then the cell would be able to break down one glucose molecule, and that might be it, or it would have a limit. So what happens is that NADH gets recycled, okay? So right here we have this recycling. So don't worry about what's happening there. Just know, oh, we need to recycle something. But when that happens, the pyruvic acid or that pyruvate has to be broken down a little bit more. So it's either broken down into lactic acid in animals or ethanol in yeast and plants. And you're probably familiar with the effects of lactate or lactic acid in your muscle cells because that's what causes muscle cramping. So to summarize, anaerobic respiration, we only get 2 ATP. Okay, so that's kind of sad. You only break down the glucose a little bit. A little bit is better than nothing. You still get energy, but aerobic respiration, once oxygen is available and that pyruvate can go into the mitochondria and be broken down even more, then you get 36 ATP. So that makes for much happier cells because you're getting a lot more energy for the same glucose.